For over 200 years, trains have changed our lives. They reshaped our towns and cities with literally groundbreaking engineering.
The idea of the underground, this was a completely revolutionary, visionary idea.
Inventions like the rocket powered Britain's industrial revolution and helped build an empire. They ushered in an age of leisure tourism and luxury travel that we still enjoy today.
The train allowed people to escape their everyday life.
And speed masters like the legendary Flying Scotsman even changed our diets.
Fish can be caught off the Cornwall coast and brought into London within a day.
This time, the story of how Britain became addicted to speed, obsessed with moving people and goods faster and faster.
The railways invented speed.
The battle for passengers was fierce in the age of steam.
This icon of steam, rail and glamour whizzing past your face.
Later, a global race drove us into the high-speed era, with the bullet train and the TGV. And into the future, how fast can the train go? These are the trains that built Britain. (1920s) Britain, a nation still recovering from the Great War. The country was in the process of rebuilding, and the spirit of renewal was felt keenly on the railways.
Already the passengers are arriving at the station, and here life is just one arrival after departure.
At the start of 1923, 4 railway companies dominated Britain's network of tracks. Some of the most popular routes had to be shared between them, and competition for customers became fierce. One such destination was the prestigious London to Edinburgh route, shared between the London and North Eastern Railway, LNER, and the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, LMS. Keep up at the back.
So because of the grouping of the railways, if you wanted to go up to Edinburgh, you had a choice. You could either go to London King's Cross and get on the London North Eastern Railway, or you could go and get on the London Midland Scottish route.
Each company was seeking something new and exciting to lure passengers away from their rivals. And here at King's Cross, the London and North Eastern Railway was on the verge of a major breakthrough.
There was always a great rivalry between the East and West Coast routes as who could get to Scotland the fastest.
And in the public relations battle, speed was going to be the winner. The LNER's answer for that: Flying Scotsman, the most famous locomotive of all time. Running non-stop along the 393-mile route, it cut the journey time between London and Edinburgh to just over 8 hours.
Well, the non-stop service in 1928, when they launched that was very much a coup, because this was the longest journey you could go non-stop in the world.
The Flying Scotsman name was nothing new and had been associated with the London to Edinburgh service since the 19th century. But in 1923, a brand new locomotive bearing the name was introduced. It was designed by one of the great engineers of the 20th century, Nigel Gresley.
The Flying Scotsman was a development of lots of things that went before it.
When it came out, it was regarded as colossal. It was the biggest engine, express engine, on the network at that time.
It had huge driving wheels, and also it had improved valve gear, which are the things that enable the steam to get into the cylinders and go along the pistons and so on.
Almost 90 years after it first built up ahead of steam, this famous locomotive is still running and is now making sightseeing trips between London and York. Andrew Martin is a railway historian, and like many other train lovers, his favourite is Flying Scotsman.
I mean, you'd know it was going fast because in the dining car your knife might be tinkling against the glass. Your gin and tonic would be wobbling a bit. Well, it was supposed to be glamorous. There was a barber for men. who shaved you with a cutthroat razor, going at 90 miles an hour. There was a salon de coiffure for women. Of course, there was a bar and there was a restaurant. The first class especially was very well appointed.
For the London and North Eastern Railway Company, who ran Flying Scotsman, luxury was not its only selling point. It was designed to win the publicity war by being faster than the competition. And as all train buffs know, Flying Scotsman was so fast there wasn't even time to put the word "the" in front of it. To achieve that goal, the train's designer, Nigel Gresley, was asked to oversee an attempt to reach the seemingly magical speed of 100 miles per hour. The record attempt was to take place on the 30th of November 1934, between Leeds and here, at King's Cross.
Well, the 100-mile-an-hour run was a publicity stunt, like all these record attempts. But this was all about an excuse for a headline. A speed record gives you a pretext for a headline. And it was all about getting the train into the newspapers.
The man trusted with pushing this steam engine harder and faster than ever before was William Sparshott.
Apparently when William Sparshott set off, he said to some onlookers, because in those days lots of train spotters around, he said, well, if we hit something today, we'll hit it hard. Because he was known as a hard-driving driver.
To calculate the speed the train would reach, a special measurement carriage, known rather wonderfully as a dynamometer, was attached, and it still exists today. The dynamometer car has been extensively restored by the National Railway Museum in York.
We're in the dynamometer car, which came into service with the North Eastern Railway in 1906. It's a mobile laboratory specifically designed to measure the power of steam locomotives. There would be one gentleman here in this seat. He would be in charge. There'd be one on each side of him holding those bulb buttons there, because when they're reading all this apparatus, it means nothing unless they know where they are. So speed was a crucial factor of the whole picture. And every quarter of a mile, when they see the mileposts, those fellas would push that button and it would record on here. This is a dynamometer car roll, typical of something that would have passed through this machine. The boffins could look at this. They could work out the speed and all the other things they needed to know as well.
On the day of the record attempt, the engine maintained a pretty high average speed on the outward journey from King's Cross, but nowhere near fast enough to hit the headline-grabbing 100-mile-an-hour mark. So would the train fail publicly after all that elaborate PR? It looked like Flying Scotsman wouldn't be making the front page after all. But on the return leg from Leeds, driver Bill Sparshott knew he still had one chance of hitting 100 miles an hour. On a downhill section of track, 90 miles from London, he stoked the engine and gave it a last shot.
Coming down from Grantham, Stoke Bank, approaching Peterborough, they touched that magic 100 miles an hour. But of course, the press are already primed. They've got photographs. They make sure that it goes on the news that day when it comes in, and it's in the newspapers the following day.
And absolutely amazing from the fact that in 130 years, the train has gone from a rattling along 5 miles an hour to a shooting 100 miles an hour. Britain really feels it's leading the world in trains.
Flying Scotsman captured the public's imagination. The train even starred in a film bearing the same name, complete with thrilling sequences of the heroine desperately clutching to the outside of the carriages as it speeds through the countryside. By breaking the 100-mile-an-hour barrier, Flying Scotsman kicked off a new era of speed on the railways. Trains were fast, and the competition was furious.
People had never seen stuff going this fast.
Trains were about to get more powerful,
These were the racehorses of the railway world.
more streamlined, and even faster. Flying Scotsman. Its engineering represented the peak of the steam age.
But how did what became known as the steam age actually begin?
Britain, before train travel, moved at a more leisurely pace. It was still a land of long country walks and unhurried cricket on the village green.
Before the advent of the railways, nobody really travelled faster than a horse could gallop. There was a network of stagecoaches which were pretty slow, would take, maybe 10 miles an hour, 15 miles an hour average at the best. And so there's no way of getting around, and nobody had travelled very fast at all.
But the Industrial Revolution would change everything. Factories sprang up, producing huge amounts of consumer goods. And captains of industry demanded their products were transported more quickly than the competition. Merthyr Tydfil, South Wales, was a centre of the Industrial Revolution and home to 4 of the greatest ironworks in the world. It's also the place where rail travel was born. In 1804, a machine designed by engineer Richard Trevithick was tasked with hauling 10 tons of iron from these works. By mounting a high-pressure steam engine on wheels, he invented the world's first locomotive, though speed wasn't its forte.
The early locomotives were really primitive affairs and could get up to maybe 4 or 5 miles an hour. They weren't really seen as an invention that would, within the space of 20, 30 years, be taking people across Britain at 40 or 50 miles an hour.
Soon, railways were springing up all over the country.
In October 1829, in the village of Rainhill in Lancashire, trials were held to find the fastest locomotive for a new line between Liverpool and Manchester. These revolutionary trials tested the 5 competing engines to their limits.
The Rainhill Trials was a fantastic media event. Thousands of people turned up to watch these engines racing each other.
One of the entrants was a Robert Stevenson.
He was desperate to prove that steam power was the way forward. So he put in to this trial his idea of what could be the perfect locomotive to haul trains.
Over a century before Flying Scotsman did 100 miles an hour, Stevenson's locomotive, the aptly named Rocket, did 30 miles an hour. That's 3 times faster than a horse and cart. On the day of the trials, around 15,000 people turned up to watch Rocket trounce the other 4 entrants.
Stevenson's Rocket was a revelation. And it's unimaginable. People who'd only ever gone as fast as a galloping horse could take them now watched this little yellow locomotive whizzing up and down the track. Absolutely astonishing.
The Rocket became so famous, a replica was featured in this 1923 Buster Keaton film. While it was slow by today's standards, or actually not that slow if you've been stuck with leaves on the line or fallen trees or signal failures or staff shortages or whatever. Anyway, it wasn't very fast. But Stevenson's Rocket kicked off a period known as Railway Mania.
Through the railway mania of the 1840s, people begin to realise that trains mean speed. You can whiz across the country, and most importantly, you can get goods from A to B incredibly quickly. Your mail could go by train so quickly, and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was the first railway to carry mail.
The increased competition between rival companies during this period of railway madness continued to drive up speeds, and this had a direct and revolutionary effect on what people ate and drank.
Speed is so important to the Victorian diet because really they were very limited to what they could get around them in terms of perishable goods, in terms of dairy, meat, milk, eggs.
Are you sure it is quite fresh?
Perfectly, madam.
Strawberries, fruit sent in from quite distant farms into the centre of the major cities.
Fish can be caught off the Cornwall coast and brought into London within a day.
Every aspect of people's diet was improved.
As Victorian railways stretched and branched and snaked into the countryside, they affected the lives of more and more people.
You must remember that people had never seen stuff going this fast. When someone called them fire-breathing devils as they passed along the farmland, hurling out smoke and sparks and steam. This must be terrifying to you.
There were fears that travelling at speed might mean that maybe all the animals in the field would die of shock. The sheep would all end up black from the smoke.
But these worries weren't limited to the man in the field or the woman in the cobbled street. Even the Queen herself felt the same way.
Queen Victoria was a bit apprehensive about the railways. She didn't like the idea of going fast.
She said 30 miles an hour was all she would go at because otherwise it was bad for her health.
So when the Royal train went through, it did cause congestion because the other trains would be held up behind her.
But the Victorians weren't just frightened that speed might damage their bodies. They were also concerned about losing their minds.
The fact that it's going so fast, so quickly, will drive man into this animalistic wildness. And there's a great picture on the front of the police news of a man jumping into a railway carriage, a maniac striking his friend. The idea is that suddenly, if you get on a train, it can send you so wild you could want to kill one of your friends.
Much as the public loved sensationalist newspaper stories, they loved the new railways even more.
And as the trains accelerated, travel between Britain's major cities became more widely accessible to the public. And to them, Flying Scotsman steaming between London and Edinburgh came to represent a golden age. And they still love it. In Kettering, the recently restored Flying Scotsman arrived after the 2.5-hour trip from London. And crowds of fans still turned out to witness a unique piece of railway history.
It's just a very major celebrity, isn't it? Surrounded by hundreds of people. It's quite touching to think apparently all the local radio stations along the way, wherever it goes, they tell people it's coming. It's like this message relayed across the whole country.
It's fast, because when you're at 75 mile an hour, it feels like it's floating. The higher speed you go, the more it settles down. It just means that you get a lot of dust here because there's like a little vortex in the tender with all the coal dust, as you can probably see.
Flying Scotsman's achievement in breaking the 100-mile-an-hour barrier meant its place in history was secure. But it still wasn't fast enough for its designer, Nigel Gresley. Flying Scotsman was soon overhauled by what would become the fastest steam-powered locomotive in history, an engine known as Mallard. Its sleek, curvy look announced a new era in high-speed train design.
Mallard's bodywork was done at a time when streamlining was everything, and actually it was modelled similarly on a Bugatti car. It was designed to cut through the air. It was a very fast train indeed.
They were designed for pure speed, so these were the race horses of the railway world. And it was taken out on this test run. The directors of the London North Eastern Railway and the engineers, Gresley chief among them, wanted to see how fast they could go.
In 1938, just 4 years after Flying Scotsman hit a century, the Mallard smashed the record as the speedometer hit 126. And it retains the title to this day, the fastest steam engine ever.
In 1934, we had the Flying Scotsman, 100 miles an hour. In 1938, we get the Mallard, 126 miles an hour. Absolutely amazing. They can't be bettered.
So this was maybe the high point of steam engine technology, celebrated at the time as a great achievement, but probably the end of an era of a particular technology.
To all with a soft spot in their hearts for steam locomotives, it's a sad farewell to one of the finest ever built, Mallard.
The steam locomotive, by now well over 100 years old, was beginning to show its age. And they were fantastically complicated machines, with many moving parts which needed constant maintenance. And steam trains had to carry huge amounts of heavy fuel, coal. These much-loved but essentially inefficient engines like Mallard and Flying Scotsman were about to be left behind by diesel power.
Now, meanwhile, there was a new lobby at work, which was the oil lobby. Oil offered this new promise of the internal combustion engine, the diesel engine, and a new form of train that would not only be fast, but it was a machine that you could switch on at the turn of a key.
And there was one country that was racing ahead with this new technology.
In America, in the 1930s, the rail companies decided to develop a completely new generation of trains. These were diesel trains, which looked very modern, a sort of mix of Art Deco and modernist, travelled much faster than anything before.
1934 saw the introduction of the diesel-powered Zephyr.
This train, built of stainless steel, just weighs nothing. 10 men can easily haul it along the track.
On the 26th of May, it made a record-breaking dawn-to-dusk run between Denver and Chicago, covering the 1,000-mile journey in just over 13 hours.
America's famous streamlined train gets up speed on its new record-smashing transcontinental run and attaining a maximum speed of 120 miles an hour.
The Zephyr was the first of the diesel-powered streamliners, considered by enthusiastic enthusiasts as the most beautiful and glamorous trains ever built.
Diesel was less picturesque than steam, but it had made trains faster, more reliable and more efficient, and higher-speed passenger services began to appear all over the world. But by the 1950s, a serious rival to this supremacy had emerged.
The Renault Dauphine. First, see the Dauphine's maneuverability in traffic. Look how it gets around.
After the Second World War, most countries across the world expanded their road networks. Cars became much cheaper.
The car was so speedy and so independent, you can go anywhere.
But cars weren't the only threat.
And aloft, cruising in comfort at 10 or 20,000 feet.
The aircraft had arrived. Planes were now flying quickly, frequently and safely.
And there was a general feeling that really the age of the train was now past.
When you listen to a lot of politicians talking in the 1950s and 60s, the train was some old-fashioned Victorian thing that we had to get rid of. That was the argument being pushed, and a lot of people believed it. So the railways were, in a way, they were under real threat, and what they needed to do was to push back hard.
By the 1950s, it looked as if the train had had its day as the go-to mode of transport. People were going to wherever they were going by car. The railway industry responded in the only way it knew how. It made the trains faster. Within the space of a century, trains had transformed how fast we could move, from the speed of a galloping horse to the 100-mile-an-hour Flying Scotsman. But by the end of the 1950s, aeroplanes and cars had eclipsed trains. UK government policy was overwhelmingly anti-train and pro-motorway. Politicians argued trains were simply no longer the way people wanted to get around in a hurry. But then, seemingly out of the blue, came a revolutionary development. In 1964, as it hosted the Olympics, Japan left the rest of the world way behind, as it unveiled the world's first ever electric high-speed line and the instantly iconic Shinkansen bullet train.
Shinkansen bullet trains were a huge leap forward. They were a quantum leap.
Post-war Japan was in a terrible state. The railways were seen as a mechanism by which they could emerge from post-war state of dereliction.
The Shinkansen heralded Japan's extraordinary rise as an economic superpower, and everything about the train's design asserted its ultra-modernity.
They look more and more like alien sharks or strange creatures from lost underwater planets. When the train comes into a station, you think, whoa, I've never seen anything like it.
Inside the first bullet trains, the design was also consciously state-of-the-art.
So we're sat in the Shinkansen Series 0. It's like being sat in a 1960s aeroplane, and that's quite deliberate. It's designed to be like an aeroplane, designed to empty the airlines, designed to make you comfortable at high speed.
In stark contrast to most of the rest of the world, the Japanese invested heavily in trains.
In the 1960s, if you were in Britain, rock and roll cars and planes. You know, people wanted their Ford Zephyr or whatever to roar up the M1, which was brand new, nobody on it. Well, the Japanese didn't go down that road. They said, no, we're going to go with a fast train from point to point.
Not only were they fast, they were famously comfortable.
The Shinkansen trains are probably the smoothest trains I have ever travelled on. The train just eases away from the platform.
Travelling on a Shinkansen train at speed is as if you were riding along a silk kimono.
The bullet train ran on dedicated high-speed tracks at 130 miles an hour and slashed the journey from Tokyo to Osaka from 7 hours to just 4.
In iconic terms, this train ran past Mount Fuji. It meant you had a picture of modernity. It meant Japan had stepped away from the horrors of the Second World War and was proving that it was forward. It was forward in a new way.
The Shinkansen bullet train wasn't just an engineering advance. It transformed Japan's post-war, post-traumatic economy and culture.
It was also the inspiration for a new high-speed age around the globe.
After the unveiling of the bullet train, we really start to see a train race, a train arms race, you might say, throughout the world.
Back in Britain, there'd been little investment for decades.
Britain's railway was in slow decline, really, in the 1960s and 1970s.
British Rail had become more famous for its delays, uncomfortable carriages and soggy sandwiches than for technical innovation.
But there was one vehicle, one train, that actually changed the face of British rail.
10 years after Japan launched the bullet train, Britain was back on the fast track with the Intercity 125.
From Birmingham to Bristol, Liverpool or Leeds, buy a ticket, take a train and travel where you please. To Manchester or Glasgow, Canterbury or York, from here to there and back again without a moment's thought.
Poetry in motion. Named after its top operating speed of 125 miles an hour, the 125 remains the fastest ever diesel-powered train. And it had a completely original design. The nose was streamlined like a racing car. The train was fashioned from robust moulded plastic, and the power was souped up with a diesel-electric car at each end of the train.
It was the bringing together of so much tech into one place that made this a revolutionary train. And frankly, it conquered the whole of British Rail, and it saved British Rail. It really was, and it was known as the journey shrinker.
But in spite of its success, the Intercity 125 was facing stiff competition from buses, coaches and cars.
A canny marketing campaign tried to persuade car-mad Brits to embrace what the new train had to offer.
When was the last time you made a long business trip and your train had to stop for breakfast? Stop for you to do some work? Or stop to spend a penny? See your dealer about an Intercity 125. Much quicker, we think, than your 1.6, your 2.3, your 2.8. Intercity.
It's a lovely comparison of road and rail. It was so successful, actually, other countries licensed the concept out for their own railways. So Germany did a similar advert, almost exactly the same, with some of their electric trains later on that year.
Even though it could carry passengers between cities quicker than ever before, even while serving them the legendary Intercity Sizzler cooked breakfast on the way, one thing was holding the 125 back from achieving its full potential. It was still running on these same tracks that had carried Flying Scotsman 50 years earlier.
In the late 70s, you've got Britain's high-speed train, the 125, herring around on Victorian technology, really, on these ancient railway curvy routes all over the place. But in France, they go one step further. They make this better. They build dedicated, brand-new, high-speed tracks, which means that trains go much, much faster without the impediment of going around corners or slow trains getting in their way. And so the top engineers in the country come together to build TGV, a train grande vitesse.
The Intercity 125's time as the most advanced train in Europe was over. Fini. This was a new dawn for high-speed rail on the continent, and the French TGV was at the forefront. In a dazzling test run in 1981, France's first high-speed train clocked up a breathtaking speed of 236 miles per hour.
The train is zipping along so fast, you see the dust coming up past the train, and the people on board are cheering. And it's truly a magnificent moment.
It smashed the previous record by an incredible 30 miles an hour.
And in 1981, France seizes the high-speed crown.
And you would do after all the investment from the government to get into this massive high-speed train project.
Later that year, the line from Paris to Lyon was opened to the public. The train's operational speed was actually quite a bit slower than the exuberant test run, but at 161 miles an hour, it was still the fastest train in the world. The debut of the TGV marked the start of the French government's massive expansion of high-speed rail. It was a symbol of national pride and, of course, the envy of the rest of Europe.
Here in Britain, our trains were still crawling along on decades-old track. But what came next would completely change the UK's railways.
In 1976, Britain unveiled the fastest diesel train in the world, the Intercity 125. But it wasn't long before the French TGV raced straight past us.
But then, historic rivalry turned to cooperation. It was a railway entente cordiale, and something amazing happened. The world's longest international rail tunnel was built, and Britain, for the first time, was joined to Europe.
On the other side of the wall of chalk, only a few inches thick, his British counterpart, Graham Fagg, was drilling too.
The 1st of December 1990. Somewhere under the English Channel, 2 construction workers drilled through the final section of rock to join the 2 halves of the Channel Tunnel.
They're through! They're through! They're through! Hey! There's the handshake we've all been waiting for!
This was the first time that Britain and mainland Europe had been directly connected since the last ice age.
As the 2 tunnellers exchanged national flags, as the champagne flowed in probably the biggest ever underground party, the entente was very cordial.
Arriving for the 9:53 to France. This was the Queen's first glimpse of Waterloo's glittering international rail terminal. From here, the Eurostar Express will begin its 3-hour journey to Paris.
But when the tunnel finally opened for business in 1994, the trains only ran at high speed on the French side. For the opening ceremony, the Queen travelled from Waterloo to Calais at a sedate 80 miles an hour. Whereas in France, President Mitterrand's party raced to Calais at over double that speed, 186 miles per hour. The reason for this disparity was simple.
Trains ran high speed from Paris across the country into the tunnel at great speed and then emerged and then slowed to a crawl as they came out, off dedicated railway lines onto Britain's Victorian railway network.
In fact, it wasn't until the 21st century that Britain caught up with its old rival. Finally, in 2007, Britain opened its first ever dedicated high-speed line.
These trains now race from here at St Pancras Station to the Channel Tunnel at speeds of up to 186 miles an hour, cutting the journey time to Paris from 3 hours to just 2 hours and 15 minutes.
Today, all across Europe, high-speed networks are expanding rapidly. While Britain's HS2 struggles amid massive controversy, the rest of Europe has decided to go ahead. Why?
High speed has developed so much across Europe for a key reason. There are so many countries or big cities quite close together, which it doesn't really make sense to fly across. Under 2.5 hours, rail becomes a real competitor. Now, why wouldn't you want to travel from city centre to city centre and avoid all those horrible queues and all that awful stuff and get a great view and get up and walk around a bit? I mean, that is how you want to fly around Europe. You fly around Europe by train.
And it's not just Europe. From South Korea to Saudi Arabia, there are now high-speed networks in over 20 countries. Japan, the country that pioneered high-speed travel, has a vast network of famously punctual bullet trains. Whilst the view is unchanged, the trains have sped up since their debut in 1964, with the fastest Shinkansen running at an incredible 199 miles per hour. But the Shinkansen is no longer the fastest passenger train in the world. It's been overtaken by China.
The Chinese have developed an amazing network of high-speed trains, really linking all their major cities with high-speed lines because they realise that it's a much more efficient form of transport than aviation.
Japan versus China in terms of railway speed, of course it's a cultural rivalry, an economic rivalry, a political rivalry. They watch each other across the sea and they want to beat each other.
They are just smashing through new high-speed lines. They haven't got to deal with Victorian tech. They're going straight to electric power and proving themselves on the world stage.
And this means the authoritarian and increasingly confident Chinese now have the longest and fastest rail network in the world. Between Beijing and Shanghai, the train goes at 217 miles per hour.
Trains will carry on getting faster as long as the technology and physical manifestations of that enable it in a safe way to do it. We are talking about things that run on 2 strips of steel, on little wheels.
But the Chinese have built something that doesn't rely on wheels, the maglev. It glides across the track using magnetic levitation. This lack of friction means the maglev can go faster than any other train in the world.
This train does actually feel very different from a Japanese bullet train. It's a hell of a lot faster. But the minute it starts to move, the train starts to tip forward, you find yourself leaning back, and within seconds, you're literally being thrown round corners, and you can feel the skin on your face being pulled back.
Not entirely appealing. The track is only 19 miles long from Shanghai Airport to the city, and the maglev covers this ground in just over 7 minutes, reaching a top speed of 268 miles an hour. That's the absolute fastest any paying train passenger anywhere can go. So is this a vision of the future, or some more comfortable version of it?
Trains and speed are inextricably interlinked, and the train is getting faster and faster every decade. I wonder whether those Victorians who were so delighted by going at 60 miles an hour could imagine there'll be Japanese and Chinese trains now going at over 500 kilometres an hour.
What is amazing today is that this 19th century invention is now a very clean form of transport with electric trains. It's seen as environmentally much more sustainable.
It'll be lovely to watch a Victorian technology come into the 21st century and continue to deliver on the promises it made all that time ago.
In a way, it's the car nowadays that is seen as an old-fashioned invention. The railways are seen as modern, and maybe one day they might even outlive the car.
Barely a century after Flying Scotsman steamed into the history books, breaking the 100-mile-an-hour barrier, trains now go at once unimaginable speeds. And as ever, we ask, have they reached their limits? Can they really develop any further? Trains have faced setbacks and challenges, which really should have seen them consigned to the Transport Museum. But every time, they have adapted and survived. The fact is, they are now carrying billions of people around the globe faster than ever before. It does appear that the solution to our transport problems has been with us all along. Hello, chaps. Forward to the past.
And Ian's back brand new next Friday at 9. Join Tony Robinson on a global adventure as he goes around the world by train, streaming now for free on My5. And here on Channel 5, celebrate classic comedy with Only Fools
(1920s) Britain, a nation still recovering from the Great War. The country was in the process of rebuilding, and the spirit of renewal was felt keenly on the railways.
Already the passengers are arriving at the station, and here life is just one arrival after departure.
At the start of 1923, 4 railway companies dominated Britain's network of tracks. Some of the most popular routes had to be shared between them, and competition for customers became fierce. One such destination was the prestigious London to Edinburgh route, shared between the London and North Eastern Railway, LNER, and the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, LMS. Keep up at the back.
So because of the grouping of the railways, if you wanted to go up to Edinburgh, you had a choice. You could either go to London King's Cross and get on the London North Eastern Railway, or you could go and get on the London Midland Scottish route.
Each company was seeking something new and exciting to lure passengers away from their rivals. And here at King's Cross, the London and North Eastern Railway was on the verge of a major breakthrough.
There was always a great rivalry between the East and West Coast routes as who could get to Scotland the fastest.